Hello, Aryeh.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And I'm really looking forward to this. This is going to be a fun conversation. Because first of all, let's lead with the big news. You have a show that was birthed on Bloggingheads TV called Culturally Determined.
Correct.
And it is about to get its own YouTube channel.
Yes.
You've earned your wings. Now you will still be in the Bloggingheads TV podcast feed and on the Bloggingheads site, but as a YouTube matter, you're going to have your own channel. The only other person who's done this is the estimable Glenn Lowry. So you're now in a pretty impressive company. He just did it a couple of weeks ago. He's got his own channel. He also is still in the Bloggingheads feed and on the site.
Right. So
how does it feel? Aryeh? You have goosebumps?
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Glenn is, most people watch this probably know who Glenn Lowry is, and he's sort of become the superstar of Bloggingheads over the past couple of years. And yeah, so he moved off onto his own channel, and I'm doing the same. So I'll have to see what happens. And you did an episode with Glenn where you talked about some of the reasoning behind this, and it has to do with algorithms and the way YouTube prioritizes content and suggests content, and how we think we understand that process. But anyway, it seems like hopefully this will be a win-win, a non-zero sum interaction, and
that is the
Aryeh
that
fans
is the
will
argument.
find Aryeh content, and the Aryeh non-fans who
will find non-content.
There are a fair number of them, and some of them overlap with Glenn fans. People who don't like my content that much, they will not be shown my content, and then they will not leave a nasty comment or a thumbs down or something like that.
Yeah, not that we don't like people who leave nasty comments. They're all part of the glorious diversity of life. But so we're going to talk more about this at the end. Now that we've got people on the edge of their seats, wanting to hear more about YouTube's algorithm.
Yeah, if you are watching this on YouTube, the link will be below, and on Bloggingheads, the link will be below. And I think if you
the link to your YouTube channel.
Yeah, the new channel. And I think if you search Culturally Determined, it should come up. I don't think there's anything else that has that name. So it's a fledgling thing. So there's not that many subscribers yet. So if you if you want to keep following my video content, you can subscribe, and it'll be delivered to you.
Okay, so we'll get back to that at the end a little, I think, and talk more about the logic behind it. But meanwhile, we're going to talk about a number of things, including maybe doing even a little reminiscing. I mean, the other thing I should say is, for a long time, you were working for Bloggingheads, and you weren't present at creation, at the founding of it, but as soon as I turned it into an enterprise of a certain scale, that is to say with multiple employees, you were one of the employees. And this was, I think, 2007?
Yes, I started late as a freelancer in late 2007. So
the site itself was started in 2005. I founded it along with Mickey Kaus and a tech genius named Greg Dingle, who was very important because, the way we did it. And I still remember, if you would like to have me relive a great moment in technological history that only I was present for, only I can attest to, I'll be happy to help you with that, Aryeh. Would you like to hear a great moment in technological history?
Go ahead.
Well, if you insist. So I remember we were trying to think of a way to do the split screen video thing online, and the problem was broadband hadn't really arrived. Almost no one had broadband. And so you couldn't do what we're doing now, which is have the video conversation and just tape it. And what I realized was you could just be having a phone conversation, and each person on each side is taping locally a video of themselves with not even a webcam, laptops didn't come with webcam standard then. The first we used camcorders. I remember I personally handed a camcorder to like Matt Iglesias in a Starbucks in DC. I gave one to Jonah Goldberg. I mean, for a while, we were issuing them to people, after it expanded beyond me and Mickey. So anyway, I realized you could if you each taped it and then uploaded it to a server, you could somehow put them together. And that's the part that Greg Dingle, didn't just figure out. I mean, obviously it's doable, but he created a pretty user-friendly template for doing it. So in fact, I was the one doing it at first. I was the one doing production. And the rest is history. Now it is a global media juggernaut. And rumors that we will acquire CNN, I can't comment on, but let me just say that's not going to happen. I will say that. So
you had this idea, and so you were ahead of your time in envisioning something that would become a sort of standard format in various ways online, but the technology didn't exist for the average person to do something like this, and so it took a lot of work behind the scenes. Physical. Sometimes people were recording on like a physical drive or something, and then they would mail it, and people were talking to each other over the phone, and sometimes it would take 8 hours for someone to upload if they were still on like a 56 modem or something, and and whereas now we're using there's multiple forms of the software that enables this. Everyone, because of the pandemic, everyone knows how to use Zoom, and now it's sort of it was novel in 2005 and stayed that way for a while, and then the technology caught up, and now pretty much anyone can do it.
Anyone can do it. I mean, it's actually kind of just getting to that point that you've got software out there that makes it almost a push button operation.
Right. You needed
to actually generate the file.
If you have like zero tech skills, maybe it would still pose some challenge, but
it's getting close where you have to pay for the software. I'm not aware of any free software that makes it super easy. But yeah, and then also, I mean, separately, there's the podcast thing. And I want to say, we won't reminisce here forever. We'll be getting into larger social and or political issues, some of which are connected to this subject in a way. But there is also the whole podcast thing. So from the beginning, we were in effect a podcast in the sense that we had downloadable audio from the beginning. But I don't think, I mean, technically a podcast is something that involves an RSS feed, I guess, and I don't think we're plugged into that avenue at that point, and that I'm sure predated us. I do think we were the first split screen video thing, certainly, that discussed politics and public affairs. Now there was something that arrived a few weeks ahead of us, the Week in Tech, which I think had split screen video from the beginning, but I think they actually had studio quality bandwidth and did it that way. I'm positive they didn't do the Flintstones method that we used, and that's an interesting case because he has turned his thing into a thriving, very profitable enterprise, Leo Laporte.
Whereas you,
I wouldn't say. Whereas I wouldn't say that I've done that. I mean, in my defense, I wasn't spending all my time on that. I mean, I got a couple of books written, right. They did well, and so on. But
it's interesting to look back, and so I mean, Bloggingheads was both a pioneer of video on the web. I mean, launching in 2005, which was the same year YouTube launched, so it must have only launched a couple months after YouTube launched, and back then, in the pre-YouTube era, you needed like a real player or various other plugins to get video, and often it just wouldn't work, or maybe you're downloading something and it didn't work. And so you were ahead of the curve in seeing that online video would become a big thing. And there's been various waves of that. I mean, there was a joke like 8 or so years ago that every website was pivoting to video, and then they pivoted away from video, and it seemed like Facebook malfeasance had something to do with that. They were counting streams in various ways that weren't accurate, and so so pivot to video became a joke. But we were but Bloggingheads was had video from the start, and at the same time, it also essentially was a the basically a modern podcast also.
Yeah.
And you could usually there was certainly a visual element, but before podcast was a term that anyone really knew, it essentially was a podcast, and so that was ahead of the curve. And I was actually talking to someone, I won't mention his name because he did it. This was just a private comment, but someone we both know who was saying, like, the idea that there would be an audience for writers talking at length about whatever is essentially, a large chunk of podcasting today, and that's what Bloggingheads was from the beginning. The very early episodes were short, but it quickly became like at least an hour, and it was different than what you would get on TV, and it was people who at least at first weren't the type of people who would appear on cable news or something like that, because a lot of them were bloggers or professors, and so there was a lot of things that you foresaw, and were ahead.
Among them, not how to build the highly profitable media empire.
The question of why bloggers didn't become, I don't even know what you would want to say. Why bloggers didn't become YouTube? That's sort of obvious because YouTube is a platform.
Well, yeah, that's a different thing, though. I mean, that was a consideration. Let me quickly say, by the way, you said, the idea of streaming video. Actually, that wasn't what was new. I actually started doing streaming video in 2000 or 2001.
Right, with the original Meaning of Life TV.
With the Meaning of Life TV site, which was conversations I had in person with people that were videoed and were done on streaming video. And in those days, you had to choose broadband or not broadband, and most people would choose the not broadband, and it was a super grainy video. And broadband just meant ISDN quality, which I don't think even exists anymore, and that was not the kind of quality we see today. But so what was new was people talking. I'm not saying completely unique, but I think in the realm of political dialogue, people who were talking remotely and it winding up as video online without like having CNN or somebody behind you, just DIY. I should just to shout out for Greg Dingle, father of the Dingle Link. YouTube had not yet been. I don't know when YouTube came into being. It certainly did not yet belong. Okay, but it did not yet belong to Google, and most people hadn't heard of it. And we had pretty much right away something that we beat Google Video to, I know, which was the now familiar interface for creating a link that begins at any point in the video. In fact, ours began and ended, I think, at any point in the video, and Greg created that. Okay, so enough trying to cement my role in technological history.
That actually, the Dingle Link is actually interesting to think about as, both. It was an innovation that, YouTube didn't have it where you could just start at any moment.
Yeah.
And then built into it was it would stop. The clip would stop. So you'd essentially be seeing a short clip and then it would stop. And you could either hit continue this video or you could go on with your life. Well, it turns out that if you're a profit maximizing corporation, you don't want them to stop watching. It just keeps it going. And then
that's a good point.
YouTube pioneered auto-playing the next video that its algorithm suggests to the viewer. And so it's a common thing. And all the streaming services do this now too. You get to the credits. You don't see the credits anymore. If you're watching a Netflix TV show, the credits start 3 seconds later. You're watching the next episode. It's autoplayed. And maybe you might have fallen asleep on the couch, but it's still streaming. And so that sort of like quasi underhanded or totally underhanded thing of just like, let's rack up the views, the seconds played, the impressions or something. Blog has never had that. And other sites gamed that system in various ways, either through total junk content of cute animals videos and cooking demonstrations and stuff, or something more underhanded like you would click once and you couldn't get it to stop playing, or something like that.
Yeah. Now, as for why we didn't become YouTube, I mean, first of all, that would have taken some real fancy footwork and real resources. But also, I remember when there were people suggesting things like that. Like, why don't you just create a platform where anybody can upload stuff? And you might have been able to kind of corner a version of that market if you had created if you had made it very this whole business of two people recording something, notwithstanding low bandwidth, that would ultimately appear as a side-by-side video. If you had taken our initial method for doing that and made it very user-friendly and invested in doing that, you might have been able to create kind of what was, for a while at least, the platform for this kind of thing. That could have happened. But I just said from the beginning, why would I want to spend my time doing a non-curated platform? I mean, I'm here to have, some kind of influence on the world at however small a scale. And once you just say anybody can do anything, you're not having influence if you're no longer being selective about the content.
Right. I mean, Google bought YouTube. The people who founded YouTube their names are not famous, but Zuckerberg would be someone who just said, let basically anything go, and we'll see what happens. And yeah, there were things that popped up, like Chat Roulette was, one sort of version.
Oh, I had forgotten that. Was that a whole site? Was that a whole site?
I think it was essentially just a website someone put together that made it easy to, and it would randomly assign you someone, and they would pop up, and then it turned into
you'd be in conversation with them, and what killed it was it would be every once in a while be some guy exposing himself to you, and they're like, oh, bad business model.
Yeah, then there is something, I think it might be called Omegle, or I don't even know if that's how it's correctly pronounced, but it's sort of, I guess, I think teens use it a lot. But yeah, there's other things that are sort of like this, but nothing. Yeah, two people talking to each other on video didn't take over as its own thing. But if we look at if we remove the video and say that just two people having an unconstrained conversation that could go as long as you want, you could say that's Joe Rogan. That's any non-investigative podcast or something.
Right. The better question is, why am I not Joe Rogan?
Right. Well, you're not.
And the answer is I just didn't want to take testosterone supplements. Well, I mean, otherwise, I would be unstoppable. Or as he would say, I would be unfucking stoppable.
Well, maybe it was personal charisma. Maybe it was that his things he was a kook about were not the things that you're a kook about. You're,
Hey, wait. Hey. Or maybe I'm not a kook at all. Just throwing that out there.
Right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
But he also, I guess, he also had a sort of take all comers kind of thing where he'd be like, oh, Alex Jones can come on. That's totally fine. Whereas you would, you drew the line very early on. In fact, I think, what's her name? Ann Coulter. Early on, there was a controversy when Ann Coulter would be allowed on, and you said lines personal. You were drawing. This person would not be allowed on. They're beyond the pale. Whereas Rogan was having Alex Jones, despicable human being, on his show.
Do you remember when somebody worked for us who shall not be named, who's now pretty prominent, made a name first on Twitter and so on, and writes for places. But as a kind of surprise for me, after Anthony Weiner's downfall, he set up a dialogue between Anthony Weiner and somebody else that was going to appear on the show. It was all set to go.
Yeah, this was.
I said, and look, that would have been ratings gold because nobody else. But I said, I'm not going to participate in Anthony Weiner's rehabilitation.
After the initial Anthony Weiner scandal, and then he was maybe launching somewhat of a comeback, and then there were two additional scandals. Yeah. Of course, he ended up in jail.
Before Carlos Danger.
I can't remember. Yes, but yeah. So there were things you would not, propriety or you wouldn't go certain areas, whereas other places would, and that going extreme is a way to get attention. So there's, that might be part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I would, but Joe Rogan's actually highly selective. It's just that his zone of selectivity includes Alex Jones. I mean, there's, he's very he doesn't have on like many avowed enemies of the intellectual dark web and stuff, for example.
Right.
But
yeah, that's true. But yeah, he has.
so he's got his thing.
Yeah, he definitely has people he likes and ideas he wants to generally promote. But he'll have, I mean, and just the idea that there's some person who has been, canceled, using that word that everyone's sick of. It's like, that adds this facade of like secret knowledge or something. And so yeah, the controversial people, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think it's. Yeah, it's interesting to wonder whether, were there junctions at which, if decisions had been made differently, Bloggingheads would now be the world bestriding colossus, or because it really, like I said, it was ahead of the curve in certain ways that were important, and a lot of media now looks kind of like classic Bloggingheads stuff in various ways, although. And I think, well, here's one thing I would say is that what the revealed preferences of the average American media consumer is they want their own tribal preferences reinforced, and they want their tribal enemies destroyed. And, videos where it's like Ben Shapiro destroys woke college student have millions of views on YouTube. And from the beginning, you were committed to, conservative liberal, progressive libertarian, religious not religious, Mickey Mouse, Robert Wright. You're committed to crossing tribal boundaries, and it turns out that is less popular than just revving up one's own side.
Well, yeah, but by common agreement, more needed now. Yeah, I mean, one thing that reinforced that was for a time. For I guess a few years, you tell me, we were featured on the homepage of the New York Times.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of how novel it was. I mean, the New York Times, God knows the production values weren't great. They were running some things with production values that would seem laughable today if you said this was on the New York Times.
Right.
And yet it's in the New York Times archives. And that reinforced our initial tendency to try to, with some frequency, have kind of debatey conversations with clearly contrasting opinions. I mean, like we had an Israeli and an Egyptian guy that, at the time, this doesn't seem amazing now, but at the time, and the New York Times, they loved that one. It was Gershom, who it was? It was Gershom Gorenberg, you just had on your show.
Right.
Talking about, he was the Israeli, talking about his new book. It's Shadow War. What is the play on Shadow War?
Yeah, that's
War of Shadows, which sounds really interesting. I listened to your podcast on Culturally Determined.
And that's an interesting episode if you're interested in World War II, and this is a story, a World War II story that is
and code
less
breaking,
told.
and it's a story I hadn't heard at all, having to do with how close the Germans may have been to taking over the Middle East via Rommel. But so anyway, it was him and an Egyptian guy. And at the time, it's not like you would see that on cable TV. It's not like they would arrange to have an Israeli guy talk to an Egyptian guy. It just didn't really happen much. And yet, suddenly we could do that. And so we did that for a while. And now we really don't do much of that mixing and matching. We may revive it. I don't know, but it's like anybody can do it. Now, I suppose in a sense there's more need for it now than ever for somebody to actually arrange to have people who disagree strongly talk, because left to their own devices, people tend to use the technology to talk to people in their own tribe. Yeah. I mean, and I mean the technology broadly, podcasting technology, and any kind of dialogue technology.
Yeah, and I do it myself on my own show. I mostly, I'm not naturally a person who enjoys debating, and it's also just easier to get someone on who I generally agree with, and I find them interesting in some way, than to get someone on who I'm like, okay, this is going to be, I need to like do research in order to counter their perspective or something. So it's much simpler just to, in general, for to have people on that you generally agree with. And
I have somewhat the same issue. I think one thing to try to overcome is the idea that you're going to need to win. Like, you're going to need for people in your tribe to say, yeah, you beat him, that's one thing that makes you feel like, oh God, I'd have to do research for a week to be ready for this. You can just go in with the goal of trying to understand their position better and telling them why, given what you know about it now, you think they're full of shit. And that's it, and call it a day.
Yeah, but the things that go viral in various realms are, someone embarrassing someone else. Yeah, the
Right.
Ben Shapiro destroys so and so.
Right.
People,
now
it turns out people want that way more than they want a balanced, polite discussion, even if in depth and intelligent. People want to see the tribal enemies destroyed.
This is one thing that held us back. Was I always felt like the people coming on, all the people coming on are our guests. Two people talking to each other, whether they're talking to me or not. And I didn't. We did from the beginning select clips. Now this was before social media was such a thing, so it's not like we were distributing them on social media, but we did try to distribute them, and then when social media came along, we continued. And I always kind of felt I don't want to try to embarrass anyone, especially not unfairly. And 60% or so, this is my out of nowhere finding. I'm going to assert that about 60% of the clips that go viral by virtue of embarrassing someone do so unfairly. They take it out of context or something. At least 60%. And I never, anyway.
So
look, there's all kinds of reasons I'm not, You
didn't have the killer instinct or the amoral, capability to Tucker Carlson invites people onto his show so that he can either, people he doesn't agree with, so that he can dunk on them, embarrass them, and cut their mic if they try to fight back enough. And then, there's never a Tucker Carlson episode where he's like the loser in the end. He's always the winner, and because it's a rigged game, and that's cable TV now and has been for a long time. And yeah, so that's popular. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to flatter myself too much. I mean, part of it is just I'm not a good. There are a lot of things I'm just not good at, like promoting stuff, scaling up an organization, and so on. But we're still here. And so I don't know. Did you had some? What else? We had thought we might talk about some other stuff, and that this subject might even lead to other stuff, as I recall.
Yeah, well, we could look back. As long as we're looking back, we could look back on the Mindful Resistance project we both worked on. I had a bone to pick with you on journalistic neutrality, which is also somewhat related. We could go there, we could talk this idea. Facebook. The power of Facebook, and is Facebook the noosphere? That's one thing I wanted to ask you about. Where do you think we should go?
Let's pass over Mindful Resistance really quickly, just because we've been doing a lot of reminiscing that may seem self-indulgent. That was the predecessor of what is now the Nonzero newsletter, which I put out and is put out more broadly by the Nonzero Foundation, as was Mindful Resistance. I mean, that actually kind of does lead to the journalistic neutrality issue, because part of the idea of Mindful Resistance was that the resistance to Trump was too reactive and mindless, and it played into his hands. And I think one of the things that played into his hands is the way the mainstream media, I think, freaked out about him. I don't think freaking out about him was by itself a mistake in judgment. I mean, I find him a very alarming figure, but more than that, I find alarming the fact that the circumstances had gotten to a point where somebody like him could become president. But in any event, I thought, New York Times, Washington Post implicitly declared war on him, and it colored their coverage, and I think in ways, and this coincided with the clickbait media economy. So like they knew which headlines were getting clicks. And so they could see that a headline kind of slanted against Trump would get clicks. And I don't even know how consciously they thought it through, but I think that led them to put out a product that made, well, not just Trump supporters, but I mean, a lot of people would say, look, your average Trump supporter is they were long ago had given up on mainstream media. That's probably true. But I think if you look at your more, say, moderate Trump supporters, or the ones that were still gettable, I think the way the media reacted to Trump alienated them further or completely or more completely from mainstream media in ways that I think have caused us problems during the pandemic. I mean, I think if you ask, well, why don't they trust these authorities who tell them that vaccines are great? I think some distrust was created by the way mainstream media reacted to Trump. I mean, CNN and MSNBC, it was, Russiagate is a good example. It's not that, I mean, I didn't dismiss it out of hand. I was agnostic. I was willing to wait and see. But it was clear to me from the beginning that I was still waiting for the smoking gun. And there were a lot of people in media, on cable TV and so on who didn't feel that way. They thought it was pretty clear, and they acted that way. And they seem to have been wrong. So.
Yeah. So, that was, I mean, I guess what I wanted to maybe talk about, and yeah, we've done a lot of reminiscing and self-indulgence, so we can keep this short, but, so the mindful resistance thing, I was working on it with you, and we had a newsletter, and obviously the project did not take the country by storm, and Trump was defeated in 2020, and so without mindful resistance taking the country by storm, so Can
I interject my final self-promotional thing?
Yes.
It did show steady growth. Nonzero now has 23,000 subscribers, a growing number of paid subscribers. It's kind of been a 4 yards in a cloud of dust struggle to build the circulation, but it's worth it continues to be worth pursuing.
Right.
And everyone should subscribe.
Yeah, so part of this is, I think you have a commitment to journalistic neutrality, and a lot of the things that you wrote a substantial number of pieces for Mindful Resistance about, say a New York Times article that cast Trump or Trump supporters in an unfair way through like subtle use of language or headlines or something, and then you were showing how, someone who was not the average New York Times reader would interpret this, stuff like that. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like journalistic neutrality of the kind that you want from a mainstream outlet like the New York Times or the Post, the Washington Post, I feel like that era has just passed, and it was almost a, maybe more of a historical oddity than some sort of standard. I mean, in Britain, there's a dozen or so different national papers, and they all have various ideological slants, and they sort of fight it out. And they, British papers will just print things that blatantly aren't true. Like they will make things up that never happened. This is more in sort of a tabloid way. Like there was a story from the 80s or something that they just made up entirely about paintings of children, sort of sentimental paintings of children that maybe old ladies would hang up in their their living rooms. Were these actually haunted and were causing fires, and causing the houses to burn down? This was based on, like an arson or something where they found like a sentimental painting of a child, and they said, well, what if this was actually haunted? And this is like a theme that one of, the major British tabloid type papers was pursuing for years, and they just, this is just entirely made up. So there's different ways that, the media could be arranged, and, Britain has had papers in some form of the free press longer than America has, and they're still going. They obviously have their own problems, but I just think like the total objectivity, just the facts style that maybe only like the AP strives for at this point. Like people just don't, I don't know, people don't want that anymore. It's clear. They want, we're inundated by facts.
I don't
everywhere.
think that is clear. I don't think that is clear. I mean, I think you're right. It may have been rare in history. Certainly there was apparently, I'm not no American historian, but there was apparently large long period in American history where the press was very partisan, and I guess it's the case that that's been more often the case than not.
Yeah, there's a lot of papers
But
where that are called like the Democrat or something, and that's because like the
yeah,
Democratic Party started it, and then it evolved into like a modern paper.
yeah, but a that shows it's possible, and the fact that it's an aberration. There are all kinds of laudable things that are aberrations, but they're still laudable. There are all kinds of things that are hard to do that usually aren't done that are worth trying to do. So the fact that it's an historical aberration has no impact whatsoever on my view of its worthwhileness. As for whether there, in what sense its time has passed, I mean, everyone agrees we're in a very kind of tribal moment, and there is a lot of demand for tribal media. As I said, the New York Times is correctly gauging what headlines were getting clicked on. That's all true. But I do think I am hearing enough discontent with the particular thing about mainstream media I'm complaining about that I think there's probably room. I think a really well done Just the News site, really well done one. I'm sure there are things out there now that are trying to do that, but something that got some attention and was really well produced. It might do better than you think. I don't know.
Well, certainly the technological incentives are going away from that, and yeah, the headline, a headline that exaggerates, is more likely to get clicks on social media. I have a theory that that like social media editors at various outlets purposely write headlines that they know are going to make people angry and get them like quote tweeted with people saying this is so fucking stupid, so that they get more impressions. So like they're purposely sabotaging their own work and making it worse to make people angry, and when people are angry they share things on social media. So that's bad. That's only good for like the bottom line or the number of clicks. And but that's where the incentives are right now. And yeah, the AP and Reuters still exist, but people, I don't know, and that has an audience, of course, but people, you can't force feed them their vitamins. Like it turns out they want they want a slant that reinforces their preferences.
Yeah, I mean, my main thing is just to say I don't think this is good. How feasible it is to produce something better is a separate question, but I'm going to continue to call attention to how bad I think media is. I mean, first of all, I should say, I don't think true objectivity is possible, but I think there are basic, if you can create a journalistic ethos that leads reporters to come much closer to objectivity than they are now coming on both sides, of course, on the Fox News side, God knows on the OAN side, as well as on the New York Times, MSNBC side. And of course, there's a hobby horse of mine, the way the world is perceived by Americans, the way, foreign policy issues are presented to Americans. That is a different kind of tribalism at work, I think. And I think that's at least as challenging to overcome. I mean, the bias that I think is there, that some people probably don't think is there, the kind of not even Americanocentric, because it's not like we're presenting the news from the perspective of someone who really wants to wisely pursue American interests. It's not. It's like we're presenting the world from the perspective of, someone who very primitively is trying to pursue American interests in a way that may prove self-defeating. Anyway, that's a separate hobby horse. And I should say, I try to address all these things in the newsletter, the Nonzero newsletter, which I'm plugging again, apparently.
Yeah, and you critique especially the way the Times writes about foreign policy, and in a very sort of us versus them, like way that seems to support more hawkishness as opposed to
and a threat
less.
inflationary. Threat inflation is a separate problem in journalism. There's an incentive to inflate threats generally in journalism, and you certainly see that in the realm of foreign policy.
Right. We didn't talk about this beforehand, but there was something that struck me. So Slate did this series, Slow Burn, is that what it's called? That was about the run up to the Iraq invasion, and you and Mickey and other people who are Slate writers, circa 2003, did a sort of roundtable that was a bonus episode to this podcast. And so tell me, this was months ago, but something I remember, I think you did say it was like, you're talking about the sort of groupthink that emerged such that, Slate, the majority of people who worked at Slate were for the Iraq war, either like rah-rah, or they're like, yeah, this is probably a good idea. And you said something like all the, like, sort of the cool kids in journalism were all for it. And does this ring a bell? Is that something you might have said?
Yeah, no, I think I said that. That was it, and Slate was one of the cool kids. I mean, some of them were making the case that, well, okay, so Slate had kind of mostly gotten it wrong. I mean, I was writing a column for Slate, and I opposed the war. And there were some other people associated with Slate who arguably opposed it. But by and large, Slate was behind the war.
Almost every major outlet.
Yeah, I mean, a perfect example of the way this worked was, so the New Yorker ran this piece by Jeffrey Goldberg, who, having gotten the story I'm about to describe momentously, consequentially, and disastrously wrong, is of course now the editor of The Atlantic. That's the way the meritocracy runs. But the story was that he ran a couple of different pieces about different things that weren't exactly flattering to the Iraq regime. But this one was providing supposed evidence that maybe there was a connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. And he ran that in the New Yorker. And he did do some of the qualifiers like, well, I'm just, I went and talked to these guys and they say there is one. Well, first of all, he was ushered, by people who would like to see us in a war. He went over to Iraq and was ushered by, I think, Kurds into some jail. And they said, here, talk to these two guys. And they said, yeah, we were, there's this connection. And he reports it. And yes, he does the qualifiers kind of like, but then, okay, so that's in the New Yorker. Then Slate has a conversation, a dialogue between him and someone equally hawkish about this. So Slate arranges a dialogue about his really, dubious story with someone who doesn't doubt it at all. Okay? So Slate performs that service, and then NPR, and actually this is most consequential when months later he goes back and does another thing for the New Yorker about it, now that there have been people like me saying this may be bullshit, and he's kind of managing to revive the story and get it in the system now. And he's interviewed by NPR, like Robert Siegel, I think, on All Things Considered. Okay, so you've got one bullshit story, and who's behind it? The New Yorker, Slate, and NPR. Who's behind getting it out there? Those are three different important. At that point, it's like the New Yorker was pretty much what it is now. People know what the demographic is. Slate was kind of younger, feistier. And edgier and cooler, I think, because, Mike Kinsley had only just stepped down as editor, and Mike was hugely and rightly respected in the media establishment, and so it really did have clout. And then there's the NPR demographic, which overlaps with the New Yorker demographic, but is also like a true mass, more than now. Was a mass mainstreaming into the liberal elite class, and all these people were de facto behind the war. I mean, New Yorker ran an actual kind of editorial by the editor,
right,
in support of the war.
So that's that's what the environment was in late 2002, early 2003. So At that time, I was in college. I was, 19 or 20 years old, and I remember. So I remember summer of 2002 talking to a friend of mine during summer break, and I was like, they're not going to invade Iraq. This is insane. It makes no sense at all. Why would they? Why would they do this? It'll never happen. And of course, I was wrong. But on my college campus, there were hundreds or thousands of people who came out for various anti-Iraq war protests. So my question is, the cool kids all ended up being wrong. A number of 19-year-old college students turned out were right that the Iraq war, that the invasion shouldn't have happened, and other sort of people who are outside the system didn't want it to happen. But pretty much everyone within the government, the media system, the cool kids, they all came to think this was a good idea. Whereas me, 19 years old, thinking like, this is so stupid, they'll never even do it. Like, how was the dynamic such that, the insiders all ended up being wrong and some group of outsiders were right? Does this make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mystery because, as you said, it made no sense. I mean, I still remember the moment where, the U.S. had been demanding, and even already was amassing troops and demanding that Saddam Hussein allow UN weapons inspectors in. And otherwise, he was going to face invasion. And so he said, okay, they can come in. And I thought, well, okay, now we won't invade. I just thought it was over. But actually, the weapons inspectors went into Iraq. They were not denied access to a single facility that they wanted to inspect. They were finding nothing, and they were finding nothing exactly in the places our intelligence had said they would find things. And so finally, we just told the weapons inspectors to get the fuck out because we had to invade the country. Now, that may sound too crazy to be real, but it's exactly what happened. The weapons inspectors were there, being allowed to look wherever they wanted. Can you find a story early on where they had to cool their heels outside of some facility because Saddam Hussein was putting up a show of resistance and they had to wait 2 days to inspect it or something? Yeah, but basically, we were learning that our intelligence was wrong. And the inspectors were being allowed, ultimately, I don't think there's a single place they asked to see that they were not ultimately allowed to see, even if they had to camp out outside of it for a day or two. And yet we kicked them out so we could invade. So I just want to heighten the puzzle. It's like, I don't have the answer.
It probably has something to do with like groupthink, confirmation bias. Once you start taking steps along the path, you're more likely to continue to say, wait, was I wrong this whole time? I was not a fan of George W. Bush as a 19-year-old, and so I probably would have opposed whatever he did at that point. But it is basically almost everyone, and so I listened to that whole podcast. I recommend people listen to it. It's interesting. Almost everyone who had some kind of power got this massively wrong. And so how can we this was a catastrophic mistake. And yet it had from the elite, it had 90% buy-in. So how can we, how do you make a system such that a mistake like that doesn't happen again? Where, all the cool people, all the smart people end up being horribly wrong. I mean, one thing would be the people who are horribly wrong get punished in some way. And that of course didn't happen. Jeffrey Goldberg is, and it's the Atlantic now instead of being run out of town on a rail. But because so many people, basically everyone, quote unquote, got it wrong, you couldn't do any sort of denazification style thing of
right. I mean, that's why, by the way, there was no accountability.
Yeah, everyone was
wrong. There was
wrong,
nobody to enforce the accountability.
Yeah.
All the powerful people didn't want accountability.
Yeah, and when listening to the podcast, a lot of people talked about how effective the Colin Powell's testimony was before the UN, and a lot of people who were sort of on the fence were like, "Well, we trust Colin Powell; he's a smart guy. He's the only one with his head on straight in the Bush administration. If he says this, it must be true." And I was just thinking back to, I don't remember that exact moment, but I was just, as a 19, 20-year-old, I was like, "Well, this is all bullshit. They just want to do this. They're lying to us," and that sort of the system, fuck the system. The system is corrupt. Perspective obviously isn't going to ascend to the higher levels of power. Like maybe Trump sort of did it in a weird way, but it's just very strange that so many people who had no power at all were just looking in from the outside could see that this was a giant mistake, and so many intelligent people who had power closer to the inside or at the very top thought this was a great idea, and yeah, none of them.
Yeah, but
And no one who got this wrong suffered in any way. The people who suffered were the Iraqi civilians and the soldiers we sent over there, and yeah.
oh, and the consequences continue to go on. Probably wouldn't be ISIS if there had, you just don't get me started on the consequences.
Possibly no Donald Trump if there was no Iraq
quite
invasion.
possibly, quite possibly. When you look at the whole picture, I want to emphasize, I didn't think Colin Powell was full of shit. I thought, okay, fine, maybe there's weapons there. Leave it to the inspectors. No one was even claiming that they had a truly, a massively lethal weapon. Nobody, I mean, some people thought maybe they had anthrax. That is a biological weapon. It's a very bad weapon, but it's not communicable. It doesn't spread. It's not like a smallpox thing or something.
Yeah,
it doesn't spread from person to person.
And listening to that podcast, the anthrax attack that happened, it actually originated in Princeton in some strange way. Things were mailed from a post box in Princeton, but that you could that's sort of a key semi-forgotten incident that freaked everyone the fuck out shortly after 9/11. And then if you think the fear of a massive anthrax attack, and how scared apparently people were, rightly or wrong, about that, versus what actually has happened with COVID. Whereas, if you had said Iran is working on the secret, biological weapon that's going to kill 700,000 Americans, including our beloved senior citizens, we would have flattened the country, to asphalt. Whereas the way it happened, because I don't know, it has something to do with the psychology of tribalism, and you can't get mad at a virus or something. There's no enemy, evil person we can destroy. It's a lot of people are basically fine with it, and all sorts of people are saying it's not even happening. It's a hoax. It's they don't want to take the shot, etc. So there's all sorts of crazy psychology that continues to play out with this stuff. But yeah, if just thinking about the alleged threat of bioweapons or chemical weapons, in 2002, 2003 versus actual COVID and the damage is wrecked across the country, it's, there's nowhere to invade to defeat COVID. I guess that's part of it.
Fear, you're right, played a big role. This was after 9/11, although it was also, a year and a half after 9/11. We had a little time to cool down, and we had invaded one country, and but anyway, and then you're right, the anthrax coming on the heels of 9/11 made that a very potent talking point.
Everyone was scared. I remember getting back. I was in college. So there'd be a package delivered at the college post office that had some, laundry detergent or something, and everyone freaked the fuck out, and they shut it down. And so there was a lot of understandable fear going on. But that's making weighty decisions from a place of fear is obviously bad. Do you want to? Well, we've probably gone on maybe longer on both of these topics. Do you want to? Can I ask you a question about foreign policy, which is one of the areas you're focusing on now in your writing and your episodes? So I guess it seems like there's pretty much broad agreement that invading Middle Eastern countries is generally going to end in a disaster. Certainly, occupying them and trying to change, impose a new government on them, this isn't going to work. Seems very unlikely something like that would happen again. Who knows? But if we take invasion off the table, hopefully, okay. So the Bob, as I understand, the Bob Wright foreign policy would say, don't invade another country unless you have UN authorization, because that is international law, and that will generally prevent a lot of problems from happening. That makes sense to me. But once we say, okay, we're not going to invade and occupy any other countries, especially countries in the Middle East, how different is your policy and sort of the restraint policy that has become more popular over the past couple of years? And the Quincy Institute is one, as a think tank that's promoted this idea, and restraint or the restrainers, I guess, is a term that's been applied to various foreign policy thinkers who are, don't want us to get involved in any more foreign wars. Where does this bleed into just sort of an isolationism or a I don't know if I'm phrasing this question well. Like after World War II, it seems like once America was sort of the hegemon, the conception became how can we prevent something like this from happening again, especially the Holocaust, or how can we prevent a power like Germany, taking so much. Like it seems like that's never going to happen again for various reasons. But how should America exercise its power if we say, yeah, we're not going to invade another country? This has been disastrous too much. And where does that leave us, especially because I don't know, I feel like I've lost, I used to be someone who was like, oh, the United Nations, we should respect them. It makes a lot of sense. I don't know. We've had a lot of international crises over the past 5-10 years, and it seems like the UN really hasn't done that much, especially COVID. The UN and the WHO seem to have really fallen down on this. And, this is not a gotcha, but if you know the name of the UN General Secretary, I've been told his name. I've seen his name multiple times. I can never remember. This guy plays essentially no role in.
I was just thinking about that the other day. Like
there was Kofi
I heard
Annan.
the name. Right. I heard that. Well, I can. Yeah, I can go a little further than that. But yeah. I think he's from Argentina or something. But or somewhere. But I was thinking about that the other day. I heard the name and I thought, even I don't remember that name because it has kind of receded in significance. I mean, the UN per se. I mean, probably more people could take a shot at the name of the WHO head. At least I've heard him at least as much on the radio as the head of the UN per se.
I mean, we've been undergoing the biggest global crisis since 1945 with the pandemic, and it seems like the international institutions have not been up to the task. Almost the national institutions haven't really been up to the task either. And so I don't know. It makes me feel like you talked a lot about respect for international law and building more, like international governance capabilities. I don't know. The pandemic has made it seem like is this a lost cause? We can barely govern this our own country.
Okay. Okay, there's a lot. You've already asked a lot.
I'm going everywhere,
okay.
But like
let me just start. Where to begin? So first of all, another plug. If you want to Google my name and what is progressive realism, you'll see my ideology spelled out in on the old kind of version of the Nonzero newsletter site at nonzero.org. But I mean, first of all, well, no, that would be second of all, wouldn't it? If you're attacked, I wouldn't wait around for the UN to respond. Okay, nations do have a right of self-defense. And, the UN, I mean, you got to remember what the UN was actually designed for. It was designed fundamentally to stop trans-border aggression. And so, for example, the Persian Gulf War was actually a good example of the UN security working well. Whatever you think of that war, Iraq had invaded Kuwait. The Security Council authorized the United States to lead a coalition that rolled back the aggression. It did. And wisely, it stopped. We stopped after rolling back the aggression. It didn't try to take over Iraq. So, the UN can work in the modern world. Now, I think we had a good opportunity right then, after the Cold War, to build on this model of the Security Council as a serious thing, because it had been paralyzed during the Cold War by rivalry between the U.S. and Soviet Union, because both of those have veto power. There are 5 permanent members of the Security Council that have veto power. But sadly, for starters, and I'm not saying George Bush complied perfectly with the UN Charter. That little kidnapping of Manuel Noriega, who was the leader of Panama.
George H.W. Bush,
Yeah, George H.W. Bush. But he did, it was an important moment when he went to the UN to authorize the Persian Gulf War. Bill Clinton, and I moderately, I wrote a skeptical op-ed in the New York Times about this at the time. He intervened in Kosovo without UN authority. It was Serbia. he was intervening in the internal affairs of Serbia. There was a rebellion, kind of in a way, a nationalist rebellion in Kosovo, and he decided he wanted to intervene on its side and against the, whatever you think of that government, the sovereign government of Serbia. And that was, I think, pretty clearly a violation of the UN Charter, what America did. And it's an interesting counterfactual. And look, again, Slobodan Milosevic was a bad guy, but life is very complicated. And the decision made at the end of World War II was to build a structure that would really prioritize ending transborder aggression, delegitimizing invasion of all these kinds. And it wasn't designed fundamentally to usher bad leaders off the stage, okay? It granted a certain amount of significance to national sovereignty, but drew the line at transborder aggression, at violations of sovereignty. So it's an interesting, and then George W. Bush, of course, ignored the charter in the case of Iraq, not in the case of Afghanistan. And I will say Clinton harnessed the UN Charter in the Bosnia intervention. That was technically transborder aggression. I could get into why it's kind of technical, but it was. And so he got Security Council support, and that's all to the good. It's an interesting question. If the U.S. had really said after the Persian Gulf War, look, we're really going to stick with this. We're really going to start taking international law seriously, and abided by that itself, and not done Kosovo, not invaded Iraq, and said that this is, this norm of actual compliance with international law is something we want to nourish, and we hadn't committed those violations of it. Libya is a borderline case, by the way, of whether there was a violation, but would Russia wound up invading Crimea, for example? Would the dust up in Georgia have happened? Well, more than a dust up. Not at all clear to me. I don't know, but part of my ideology is I think that the U.S. it's in its own interest to actually bring that kind of strictness to adherence with international law. I won't. We didn't have time for the whole argument, but
So again, I don't know much about international relations. I'm a bit of Bloggingheads consumer for a number of years. Probably the main thing that's informed me about it over the years. I mean, just a couple thoughts. One is, a violation of international law by great power there's no punishment, and so America was not sanctioned or had Bill Clinton arrested for the Kosovo invasion or military conflict. So, and Russia, Vladimir Putin was not arrested for the annexation of Crimea. So there's that. And then there's, was the UN set up to prevent transborder aggression, or the cynical reading, it was a way for the great powers to sort of divide spheres of influence. And, America continued to what it was the Vietnam War transborder aggression. Like we didn't I don't know how that all works. And,
well, technically we had been invited in. I don't know what the status of the South Vietnamese government was, but I believe you could argue that its status in international law was that for it to invite us in, we were not invading it. I mean, as a matter of fact, we were getting involved in a civil war, which is in a sense what we wound up doing in Afghanistan.
Right. But then from the opposite side is sort of the, just saying we're not going to, your internal affairs are your own, transport aggression is all we care about. Well, let's say, Germany, annexed, or the Anschluss or whatever it's called, Austria, and then other, a chunk of Czechoslovakia was taken also. And if Germany had limited the Holocaust to those areas, where you said, well, that's just internal. Those are just the internal affairs of Germany, So I mean, the specter of, the Holocaust and other World War II atrocities sort of hangs over international relations, and the idea. I mean, it seems very unlikely there'd be a second Holocaust, but the idea of preventing genocide or something, continues to.
Well, okay. I mean, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, there are cases where I wouldn't A, wait for the UN, and B, wouldn't worry about international law, and that would be a case of true genocide in the old-fashioned sense. Okay, but
that's hard. If that's sort of, it's hard. Different people. Do we go to like the genocide?
Sure, but if you're asking,
say, okay, you can ignore law now. That's okay. Like it's. This gets back to your conversation.
Well, again, it would be a case. It would be a case so extreme that I doubt you would encounter it. I mean, I'm talking the actual mass execution of hundreds of thousands of people or something. I seriously doubt.
It's unlikely that it would happen again. But at the same time, it did. It did happen once.
But the other thing I'd say is, if it's not being done by one of the big five, and you might say, well, it could be done by Russia, China, the U.S., France, or Germany, even in the modern world, could be. And of course, what China's doing, in whatever the name of the province is with the Uyghurs, is very bad. I don't think it's genocide, although people are very casually calling it that, but it's very bad. But if you imagine that reached the level of genocide in kind of the old-fashioned strict sense, then what I'm about to say would have no bearing. But it is the case that if you're talking about like Rwanda or something, the UN, the Security Council has the power, although, it's true, it's designed fundamentally to stop transborder aggression. It has the power to, there's a I forget which chapter it in, but intervene for the sake of, quote, international peace and security, I think is the phrase. That gives it, in effect, a very broad mandate. If you get a majority vote on the Security Council, none of the 5 members veto it, you can do pretty much whatever you want, which reinforces your idea that, there is a cynical reading of the UN, of the creation of the UN. It's not totally out of, not totally off base, which is that it was an agreement among great powers to run the world. Look, you could look at America's legal system and say it's a way that rich people get a better deal than poor people. Rich people commit a crime and they usually get off.
Yeah, I move
they hire a good lawyer.
That cynical position, more and more as the years go by. But but it's sort of like, I guess listening to sorry, his name is escaping me, the realist scholar who you had on a month or so ago on your show,
John Mearsheimer.
Yeah, Mearsheimer. The great powers act as they see within their own interests and the sort of state of nature on the international stage, such that there's no ultimate authority that's going to punish America or punish Russia for like doing things pretty much ever. I don't know. It just seems like we're screwed. I don't know. More and more, I tend to think we're screwed.
Yeah, but okay. But I mean, Aryeh, it's like, you gotta, I personally believe that as severe a threat as climate change is, it's not alone. There are scenarios where biological weapons get out of hand. That's a really pretty plausible scenario where an arms race in space leads to a kind of instability that creates an actual nuclear exchange. I think there are a lot of pretty close to actually existential risks to the planet. And to me, job one is making sure they don't happen. And, it has never been the case in the history of human affairs that the order brought by governance was entirely equitable, so far as I know. Once you get to any scale at all. No country. And that's unfortunate. I'm not happy about it. But I think it would be a little, in light of that fact, it would be a little unrealistic to expect fledgling global governance to be, to mature with complete justice and equitability prevailing. Yeah, it's going to have to be the great powers exert disproportionate influence and get away with a disproportionate amount of shit. I'm sorry it's like that, but it beats blowing the whole fucking planet up.
Right. I guess, the way humanity as a whole has confronted the pandemic has made me fear more for future threats. This is something, it should be pretty obvious that, like, this should have spurred international cooperation and the idea that everyone is better off if we work together on this. And it seemed to spur the opposite in a lot of cases of more nationalism and blaming things on outsiders and so forth. Maybe the fact that Trump lost was a blow against that sort of thing, but like this is comparable to the thought experiment of like, what if aliens were coming to attack? Wouldn't all the nations of the world band together to fight against them because we're all in this together?
Right.
But it kind of we had this global threat, and it hasn't united humanity. It's ripping people apart in like new insane ways.
Yeah, I mean, let me say two things. First of all, the pandemic is actually a much more complex problem than climate change, I believe. There are many more actually zero-sum dynamics. So it's like, it's true that it's good for the U.S. for a bunch of other regions to get vaccinated. On the other hand, there's a kind of self-interested rationality behind wanting to get vaccinated first, and vaccination is a zero-sum game, and so long as there's a finite supply of vaccines and so on. There are a lot of actually genuine complications, but then you're right. I mean, you do get to the fact that ultimately you need wise leaders, which is who are wise and far-seeing leadership that commands respect within their countries fairly broadly, and so on. In a situation like this, we had the opposite in Trump, and he just wants to use every crisis to maximize the amount of attention he gets, basically. And I'm not saying the Chinese leadership was by any means perfect in this either. It's been. I'm not counseling optimism, but the fact that it's such a challenge, and the fact that there's so much reason is pessimism, is the reason I'm saying you got to be realistic. I mean, the UN's not perfect. It does give disproportionate influence to a certain number of powerful countries. But right now, I think it's one of the main vehicles we've got. And I just think for the United States to continue to disregard international law in as many ways as it disregards it, including disrespect for, in a certain sense, the Security Council, is a big mistake. I'm not an optimistic person. I don't see grounds for optimism.
Yes, I know that well.
when you're talking, about existential threats, you continue to tell people you preach, and that's it. That's all I can do.
Yeah, Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I wish Bloggingheads had become the huge platform with which to do it, but we've already had that conversation. Why don't we've been doing this for like an hour and 13 minutes. Yeah. Why don't you say whatever you're going to say, and then let's get back to your show a little bit.
Right. Yeah. The last thing I'll say, I mean, a lesson. The older I get, the more the truth of it, that I see more. Just like everything is really complicated, and so that's a good reason not to invade and occupy another country, because it's so complicated. You're going to screw it up in a million ways. You don't understand what's going on, and any sort of simple answer, it seems to me, is or people who say, well, if we just did 1, 2, 3, everything would be fine. That I'm less and less convinced by that, and I may have been remembering some of the facts wrong about this, but one possible example of this is, Israel did very well initially in vaccinating its own citizens, and then people started criticizing it for not giving the vaccine to Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and they caught a lot of flack from right-thinking people in the West saying, the Israelis don't care, they want the Palestinians to die, blah blah blah. So then eventually, after they caught flack for a month or two, they gave them a shipment. The Israelis gave the Palestinian Authority a shipment of vaccines, and it turned out that they didn't want them. They didn't want the Zionist vaccines. What if they were poisoned or something like this? And then what eventually happened was that there was an article in the Times about this. Once vaccines not coming from Israel were distributed in the West Bank, the normal people, the everyday citizens of the West Bank didn't want it either. They had the same sort of objections to it that people in all across America had, where they were like, I'm feeling healthy. I've heard if you just drink a lot of water, you're not going to get this. I think it's a conspiracy, blah, blah, blah. So the simple answer of just like, these people, like, we need to blame these people, and if these people act right, then like good things will happen. It's like always so much more complicated than that. And maybe this is not the best metaphor, but yeah, it's just like easy answers are very hard to come by in general, and people, the strangeness of human beings continues to astound, and people believe all sorts of unusual things, and the internet enables them to spread their ideas, and we can see all the kooky things they believe in, and so I throw up my hands and say this is at the farce of this whole thing.
We are in agreement that the world is complicated. I'm not throwing up my hands, but we are in agreement that the world is complicated. So let's talk about your show.
Yes.
So first of all, to finish up one thought we started to express at the beginning, we were convinced by a guy who's actually kind of a YouTube consultant, an expert on YouTube strategy, that it is win-win. That, for example, if we moved Glenn's show to a different YouTube channel, it would be good for us and for Glenn. There's a logic behind that. The logic being that you want a coherent, if you're going to have a channel and you want to get YouTube's algorithm to help you as much as possible to build your channel, the channel needs to be internally coherent. In other words, there is some overlap maybe between, say, people attracted to my show and people attracted to Glenn's, but probably not like, 50%, not like a ton. And that's what they mean by coherent. This guy sounded very confident that what you want to do is, in most circumstances, you want to break things up. It's better for people to have their own YouTube channels. And so you had been kind of wanting to do that for some time, I think. But in any event, that's what we're doing. That will leave one regular Blogging Head show on the Blogging Heads channel on YouTube, which is DMZ. It's funny. I mean, DMZ is in a way the show that's truest to the spirit of the original Blogging Heads. It's a regular pair of people, Matt Lewis and Bill Scher, and that wasn't so true of the early Blogging Heads, but it is left-right kind of. Not far left or far right.
And there's people who question how, is Matt Lewis, is he defected to the other side, etc. But that is close to the original.
Well, there's people who question Bill Scher.
Yeah, there's plenty of people who think he's a sellout. Also, it's funny how they.
But anyway, it's fair to say one's left of center and one right of center, I believe. And so we'll see if they want to follow in your footsteps. In any event, all of you are on the Blogging Heads podcast feed. Although we should say you have also the culturally determined podcast feed. People can subscribe to one or both in their podcast app. Blogging Heads feed includes my show, your show, Glenn's show, DMZ, and then your feed, of course, includes you. But talk a little. I got to say, you've been very good. One thing you're very good at, I think, is spotting like emerging, kind of soon to be prominent people. Like, I hadn't heard of ContraPoints, who is now, I think, pretty well known until I saw her on your show. And there have been a number of cases like that where you, including back when you were working for us, and you would bring to my attention these people and say, I think this, So I think you've done a good job. That's one thing I would say for your show. What are the other things you like to highlight about your show, or just about the nature or focus of it?
Well, yeah, and I probably haven't done the best job selling the show in this episode because we didn't really talk about culture that much. But it's it's essentially topics I'm interested in, but broadly in the culture space, but also sort of American culture or things like that. And um, yeah, I encourage people to check it out. You can subscribe to it as an individual podcast on your podcast app, and now you can if you want to get it on YouTube. I guess you can either look at the Bloggingheads homepage where it's going to continue to appear, or you can subscribe to the channel. And like I said, I think a link will be below, and if you search Culturally Determined on YouTube, it should show up. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Like I'm just making this connection now, but sort of what we're doing is sort of we're trying to play along with the algorithm in order to get more people to watch this stuff, but we're sort of bowing to the tribalized world, because it used to be like a blog is like a cacophony of voices, and then it's narrowed, and now it's narrowing even more, so that the Glenn people will subscribe to Glenn and they'll get Glenn and they love Glenn, and then they don't have to deal with Aryeh because they don't like Aryeh, and then the smaller number of Aryeh people will subscribe to Aryeh, but they're not going to get Glenn. And so yeah, so maybe that's somewhat unfortunate. This is probably the opposite of what a salesman would say, how to promote your channel. But yeah, the algorithms encourage a sort of tribalistic siloing, and which is somewhat the opposite of original, 2008 era Bloggingheads, which was here's a bunch of interesting people with diverse perspectives, all arguing with each other. And it turns out that both for the algorithm doesn't like that, and maybe a lot of the mass of the viewing audience doesn't particularly like that either. They like identifying with a personality. Glenn is a strong personality. A lot of people like him and identify with him. You talked about this recently with your episode with the Guru podcast. Yeah, it seems personal branding, identification with someone who has a strong perspective, that's what succeeds right now for various cultural and technological reasons.
Seems to. I mean, I would say, I try to have people with a diversity of perspectives on my show. I've had, I maintain that I'm one of the few shows that can say they've had both Brett Stevens and Max Blumenthal on.
Yeah, you have a very wide range of people on, and so probably wider than Joe Rogan's range, although you're not reaching into the Alex Jones area, but then it seems like we're swimming or we're beating against the current or something.
You do too. You have a diversity of people. Yours is often cultural. For example, you've done now I think 2 episodes on Philip Roth, which Roth fans would be right to tune into you and not me. They won't be seeing a Philip Roth discussion on my show.
Right.
So you do
included multiple those conversations. It was debatey. I didn't always agree with what the Roth scholar was saying, and so I don't want to make my show like a hallelujah chorus, amen chorus, or whatever the phrase is, kind of thing of just everyone agreeing with each other. So your show, as the name suggests, largely about culture. So it's not as political as mine, although I get into non-political stuff too. But I want to say that you're also interested in the connection between culture and politics. ContraPoints is kind of a good example. And in pursuing that, you wind up with a diversity of perspectives on your show, and that's very commendable. And I think you're right. Going tribal is maybe an easier way to build a following, but we press on. We the lonely few, determined to save the world. Yeah, I think it's worthwhile. I don't work for Bloggingheads anymore, but I did for 10 or so years, and I still believe in the mission, but it's definitely going against the grain of the way one of the things I'm interested in, although the show is called Culturally Determined, is sort of how technology and material conditions sort of produce cultural effects. And so the things that the YouTube algorithm encourages end up flourishing, and then people either through a conscious choice or an unconscious choice, they all sort of talk in the same way. I don't know if you've ever seen these videos where people are like, "Hey YouTube, what's up?" Blah 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 blah. They all sort of they've trained themselves at the same cadence that somehow a combination of what people want and the algorithm rewards. And then so if you don't do that, then you're you're like sabotaging yourself a little bit just in terms of popularity and so forth. So I don't know.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that phenomenon, sabotaging your popularity.
Right. Oh, but okay. So there's the pitch. Culturally determined. Check it out. And the last thing I wanted to do is I was my very short victory lap, which is the last time we had a conversation. We talked about whether Biden would win, and you were pessimistic, and I was optimistic. Obviously, Biden won, and I actually realized.
No, wait. Fact check. I did not say there was less than a 50% chance of Biden winning. I said the common perception that, which was pretty common at the time, that he was all but sure to win was wrong. And I was vindicated. It was a very close election.
It wasn't a cakewalk.
Thank you.
So I will say what I was wrong. What I was right about was that Biden would win. What I was wrong about was I said Trump is not going to pick up. He didn't like sway people over the past 4 years. Whereas he did. He got like 8 million more votes than he did before. But Biden got like 14 million more than Hillary Clinton did. So so there's that. But the other thing when I re-listened to this episode that I forgot about is towards the end, we taped this in September 2020. Towards the end, I say, Bob, have you heard about this thing QAnon? And you said, oh yeah, I think I've heard something about that, but I'm not quite sure. And I was saying, this idea that there's sort of a fantasy world of politics where people are investigating and sort of enacting their own morality plays. I said, I think this is sort of the future. Obviously, I didn't see, the Capitol insurrection happening.
January 6th.
But just the idea that this sort of alternate reality kind of thing, Trump is going to be gone at some point, but the system that we've built for ourselves where, small groups congregate and reinforce each other's ideas and start believing crazy things like, people are like Democratic politicians are murdering small children to drink their blood. This also seems like a portent of what's to come. So yeah, and actually I had someone on talk about QAnon in 2017 or 18, I think, and I forget his name. He's a writer for the Daily Beast, actually writing a book about QAnon right now. And I went back and looked at that, and the first comment on the Bloggingheads site was, "This QAnon thing is a total joke. Why are you talking about this? It's a waste of time. It's absurd." And so there's.
Well, I hope you've tracked down that commenter and brought him or her to justice.
Yeah. So I think in some ways there are things that I've weirdly have seen coming in at least certain respects, or at least people I've talked to who have seen things coming that I expose. I talk to them and hopefully their knowledge.
Yeah. Now this is another example. As I said, if people want to know about emerging trends, tomorrow's news today, there's only one place to find it. That would be Culturally Determined.
Yes.
Available in the places I've said it's available, certainly including its new YouTube channel. By the time this airs, there will be one video up on your new YouTube channel, correct?
I think so, or at least it will be live. It'll be live and people can go to it.
I think there will be a video up. I think we're going to put your Monday video up there, and then this will air Tuesday. And the other thing is, people who wish you well should make a habit of clicking the like button on videos even that they hate. I mean, it's seriously kind of. YouTube, he's starting out. When you start your own channel, you don't have any followers, and we need to pitch in here. And clicking like on, and after you subscribe, if you click like on some videos, the algorithm will bring more people to them. Some of them will click like and become subscribers.
Often at the end of my episodes, I make a joke out of it because I'm not a self-promotional person. I'll say, like, don't like, subscribe, don't subscribe. You can do whatever you want. But yeah, I mean, there's a reason that those, people who have 1 million followers are like, smash that subscribe button right now.
Smash.
Blah, 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 blah.
Smash.
That is how the algorithm works. So, so subscribe, smash that like button, set alerts, whatever. Check it out.
Yeah.
And
rate and review. The Wright Show too, by the way.
Yes.
But mainly Culturally Determined.
Yeah, and especially, you can subscribe to the individual Culturally Determined feed on your podcast app and rate and review there. That all helps, et cetera, et cetera. The last thing I'll plug is I started a Substack. I've already fallen way behind what I wanted to do, but it's called Links I Like. It's racw.substack.com or whatever. And it's just a links compilation that I intended to put out weekly, but now is turning into more like every 3 weeks or 4
And there's
weeks.
your Twitter, and there's your Twitter handle. People can follow you on Twitter.
ARYEHCW, Twitter. Yeah, I guess that's all I should plug right now.
All right. Well, Godspeed, Aryeh Cohen-Wade.
Thanks, Bob.
You've earned your wings, and we'll see you down the road.
Thanks. I appreciate it.